Why do people stand by and let it happen? Why? I mean, if there's an issue that would mobilize people, you think it'd be what happens to children, their lives, right? But no, I mean, that's the degree to which people have been emotionally numbed and mentally numbed. And that's one of the reasons we do these campaigns, is to spark life again in people, to say, look at this big death we're part of, right? It kills minds and hearts and souls, not just bodies. And we got to break out of that if we're to have a future. So that's kind of the bigger issue here, you know.
Was Trudeau, former PM, a professed Jesuit?
He wasn't just professed, he was raised by Jesuit teachers, as was his father, Pierre. It's one of the reasons that we believe one of the Trudeau sons who died in a, quote, skiing accident, you know, you sacrifice one of your children in the cult, right? It's a sign of cultic involvement.
Did Kevin ever do any podcasts about William Coombs? That sounds familiar.
Oh, lots of them. William, my friend, who was the interior Salish man who saw Queen Elizabeth take those 10 children from the Kamloops death camp, and they were never seen again. It's on murderbydecree.com. If you look through ITCCS archives or the old ITCCS updates going back a few years, we have a whole file on William on that if you want to write to me.
So here's a question from our friend of the channel, Professor Hamamoto. Why did the Pope Francis disband the Knights of Malta in 2022?
Well, that's a very appropriate question, because this fellow Robert Prevost was involved in that, in disbanding them. You see, the Vatican has to consolidate all of the finances now. And a lot of these so-called independent orders, like the Knights of Malta, have their own money. The Knights Templar opened the first bank back in the 1300s. They had enormous wealth. That's why they were wiped out by the King of France and the Pope back in 1307, I think, and to grab their money. Well, they're doing the similar thing now, because they need to get all that money, send it into the Chinese ranks. It's part of the deal they have with China. So it's about money, as always, as all these things are. And again, I'm sure during the court case, this is going to come up, because one of the things the prosecutor is going to do is look into the whole financial aspect of Prevost's involvement with the Vatican Bank and the case you mentioned about the Knights of Malta.
Thanks for the super chat, BB. And Beverly Rhodes, a friend of the channel as well, has asked, is there a way in which remote viewing reports could help with the investigation? SVing kids is paramount. If the Alliance can help in any way, we will. Great show.
Yeah, angelfire101 at protonmail.com. Just write to me, and we can talk about that.
So all of Kevin's details are in the description box, Beverly, but you've got my email, Bev. If you want to email me, email for Kevin, I can forward that to him, and you guys can go from there. Susan wants to know, how are the Rockefellers involved with the Vatican? I saw a video of Pope Francis kissing the hands of the Rockefeller family.
I don't think it was the hand they were kissing. Well, you know, you follow the money. These guys operate in the same world. Rockefeller officially is a Baptist. He was actually a big funder. The Rockefellers were big money power behind Martin Luther King, because his ancestor had John Rockefeller I, the big mogul, was a very staunch Baptist, and he funded the early Black Baptist Church and set up the first schools for ex-slaves and that kind of thing. So religious identity is one thing, but money finally affects everybody, and it's the same network, right? Whether you call yourself a papist or a Baptist or whoever, right?
Okay, next question. 1 second, they're asking for the link again for the news that you announced. All right, there's that. So, from Hula, isn't Prevost elected to be the man to unite all religions to one global religion, as the New World Order wants now, and they will bring the Antichrist forward to make it happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, that Bergoglio, Pope Francis, so-called, was always going on about the one world church. He loved the one world order. He was urging everyone to get their shots and to line up and join hands in the one corporatocracy. I mean, the economic and political system is converging. You know, eventually there'll be one single corporation everybody works for, and it needs its religious counterpart. It needs a spiritual counterpart, which is that we're all harmonious, we're all one, we're all following the lead of Rome, and that's the dream of all these, you know, so-called popes to do that. And it's going back to, you know, the way it was in the Middle Ages, you know, and kind of in many ways, like I often call people today techno serfs, because they're still thinking like serfs, you know, that they have to look to some ruler all the time, but they got their little iPads, so they think they're modern and liberated, right? So, I mean, it's the same system. It's history going in a loop again, except now the technology is such that they can be a lot more effective in enforcing it unless we regain our sovereignty, which is why I wrote that book, which is also a good seller. Thanks to the show, there are a lot of these selling on Amazon.
So is that why they're homogenizing our countries to blend everyone into just one religion ultimately?
That's what genocide is. You exterminate all difference. You make everyone one. Only those who, you know, there was a term the Vatican popularized centuries ago, and it's called life unworthy of life. And that was a non-Catholic. You didn't have the right to live unless you were a baptized Catholic. And it's still the doctrine, even though, you know, they don't like to talk about it often, depending who what audience they're addressing. But right in the, my ancestors are going to relate to this, because we were Huguenot in France. We were French Protestants who got burned out of there and went to England in the 1600s, 1500s, thanks to Queen Elizabeth I, who gave us sanctuary. But there was, right in the Vatican Museum, you'll see a picture of a guy having his throat cut and thrown out a window. That was the Huguenot leader in France, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. And Vatican agents went in there and killed the guy, murdered him, threw him out in the street. And there it is, a big picture celebrating it right in the Vatican archives. You know, and like Pope Francis applauding the Franciscan missionaries who worked all these native people to death. He said, we're inspired by his zeal. The attitude never changes. And this intimidates people, because they realize you're dealing with the same monster. It hasn't changed over the centuries, right?
Did Bergoglio never have to answer to the charges by the ICC?
It wasn't the ICC, the International Criminal Court. That's a UN creation. That's a corporate system. We actually approached the ICC and tried to get them on board with the ICLCJ, which is us, International Common Law Court of Justice. And they refused, even though they couldn't refuse under their own mandate. We said, here's the evidence. He's committed all these crimes. You have an obligation to investigate. They refused. They said it was outside their mandate, which is a total lie if you read their mandate. So it's all politics. At that level, Vatican money controls all those institutions, right?
So, BB, thanks for the super chat again. Who was Paul Marcinkus?
It's all in the book In God's Name by David Yallop, about the murder of John Paul I, killed in the Vatican the same month the present guy got ordained there as a priest. Paul Marcinkus, I believe, was an archbishop from Chicago, tied in with a Chicago mob. Again, this present Pope Leo is from Chicago. He sowed his oats there in the mob-dominated Catholic diocese in Chicago. And you can read more about it in that book. It's very well documented by David Yallop, this investigative reporter.
All right, everybody, thank you for sharing and liking the stream. We're rapidly approaching 3,000 watching across all platforms right now, and I'm doing my best to get Kevin the questions. Kim is quite. Kim would like you to expand on. I'll put this in a more polite way. If you could expand on dark spiritual locations, implications, etc.
It had to do with not only what's going on in Rome, but kind of what it represents spiritually and historically. I mean, to give you an example, St. Peter's Square and the whole Vatican Palace is built on the grounds of what was called the Circus of Caligula. Now, Emperor Caligula was a particularly perverse Roman emperor. He used to burn people as torches during his dinners, bestiality, stuff that you wouldn't even imagine. And there's the Papal Palace built right on that energy grid, right? The columns in St. Peter's Square are columns from the Colosseum in Rome. And you know what they did to people in the Colosseum? centuries of bloodbath and torture and murder. You know, that's the energy there. And it's not accidental, because working with people, and it started for me among Indigenous elders who have an innate understanding of this, and where what are sometimes called ley lines, energy patterns in the world, where and when I was in a sweat lodge once early in this work, because I needed spiritual protection, I had a vision about this, and I had this vision of these two, they look like meteors crashing into the earth. One was in the north of Ireland, and the other was in Rome. Boom. And these two, I got the impression, and a voice told me that these are the two elemental powers in the universe at war with each other, right? And, you know, it's embodied in Rome, the opposite. They took the early energy of what I call the Jesus movement, because it wasn't Christianity. You didn't even see the cross till about 250 AD in any of the archaeological ruins or anything. The early Jesus movement that didn't believe in the state or the church or anything, he said, it's within us, the kingdom of God. We're to come together in small communities or congregations and create that new world among us, you know, be that remnant in the world and not anything bigger. And he said, my kingdom is not of this world. I mean, that shows you then the opposite energy, what goes on in Rome. Any system gets more concentrated, whatever it is. And it's true about people as they age too. I think it's my own theory that whatever we are intensifies as we get older, you know. And if you're crazy, you get more crazy. If you're self-obsessed, you become more that way. If you're giving, you become more giving, because you realize that you don't have anything to lose anyway. And so that's true for an individual and an institution. And that's why the papacy is disintegrating. It's already disintegrated in its essence. I remember I mentioned this last time when I stood in St. Peter's Square to do that exorcism. I felt like I shut my eyes and I felt like there was nothing there. It's a void spiritually. It's an emptiness that sucks people's energy in. And that's how it thrives. It's a parasitic entity. I think we're dealing with parasitic entities, whether they came from another world or from this world. But it also is generated by we ourselves and what we do every day and the choices we make and what we hold allegiance to, right? So I think that's evident when you look at more and more of this evidence, like in the catacomb, that schematic map of the catacombs, where it's situated beneath that obelisk, which is kind of the centering. Maybe it's an energy focus right on that spot. I know I tapped into it in 2009 when I'm unaware when I did that exorcism. And so I think that's kind of generally what we're doing. Now, I work with Indigenous and other communities, one group called the Covenanters, and they're kind of drawing Christians out of the churches. They're saying, no, we have to kind of recreate the spirit now outside of all these corrupt demonic institutions and churches. And we've developed more of that. We're going to write more about that. But in a way, it's not something you can write about or impart. It's something that comes from within. You've got to have that inner awareness. And the more we do that, the stronger we become, because that's where the spiritual battle begins. Like spiritual sovereignty first, political and personal sovereignty next. That's what I find is the essential kind of steps we need to take.
All right. Thank you for all the continued questions, folks. Some of them Kevin has answered in earlier episodes, and you can find the episode links in the description box as well. We're sticking to the subject at hand today, which is the announcement Kevin started with, and you know, anything pertaining to that. So Kelly, when can we expect an outcome from the International Criminal Court, if any? What are the chances of dismantling this satanic institution, or is it going to be ongoing?
No, it's falling apart, like I said, but it needs the help of all of us to do that. We have to pull these misguided and possessed people who belong to this cult out. And once that starts happening, it starts a chain reaction. You can do that in your own community. Write to us, get our material, hand it to people going into the churches. Say, do not put money in the collection plate, because you're committing a crime when you do that, for one thing. We find when you do that, it takes even just one person doing that, it sends shockwaves through the local church. They call the police, they get all panicky. They alienate their own people in the pews by acting totally paranoid about this one person standing out handing a flyer. So you create a tsunami just by taking the one action. You start creating a tsunami, and all these tsunamis all over the world are joining up now. But it starts where you are. And so you have to answer your own question. You say, okay, how am I going to stop it in my community? And believe me, I travel around, I see the impact this is having. I see church attendance falling off. There's stuff in the news about, what's happens to children at the hands of the church. Do you think any of that would be there if we hadn't have started this work in 1995? The whole genocide in Canada thing was brought up by a few of us. You have a tremendous impact, but you have to move from the static situation in your own personal life to acting, and then you start changing. You change. I like that quote from Sam Adams in the American Revolution. Somebody said, "How did you make the revolution?" He said, "We didn't. The revolution made us." So as you take a step, you start getting changed by it, and you get stronger and more clear, and then you know what to do next. You can't just sit there and have a blueprint and say, well, okay, let's do this, or you do this for me, right? That's not the way things change, right?
So Annie has asked, I imagine that Kevin also has knowledge of how the church sacrileged sacred indigenous land grounds. Will they be held accountable legally?
No. They own the legal system. They're never going to be held. And the term accountable is a word put out there to keep everybody on the hook, to make it think, oh, these people are going to be brought to justice one day. Well, can you show me an example of that ever happening in their system? Never. It only happens when other people light a fire. And the whole purpose of the church going on to indigenous lands was to commit sacrilege. It was to violate that primary energy from nature, which is that all are equal, male and female are equal. We're one embodiment of the Creator. We're to share the land in peace. That's why we set up the Republic of Canada. We reached out to the traditional indigenous people and said, we're going to create a new arrangement now, outside Crown and Vatican jurisdiction altogether. And then you just read murderbydecree.com, you'll see how they went about doing that, because indigenous people were closer to the original understanding. The people who were harmed the most in these death camps they call residential schools were the children whose parents were spiritual elders. They had the sacred knowledge. They targeted people with the sacred knowledge, because then you end up drunk on the street and your culture falls apart when you lose the bond, from the sacred tradition. So anyway, hope that answered some of your questions, but write to me. We can talk more.
A few people have asked how they can contact you. What's your preferred method?
angelfire101@protonmail.com. I don't want to give my phone number because it'll get whacked, but I'll give you a backup email, hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com, and through Shaun.
So Zachary, what does Kevin know about the mark of Cain in regards to the papal court?
Papal court. What curia means court in Latin. That's what the College of Cardinals call themselves. And to be a legitimate sovereign body, you need to be a court, and that's why they take that imaginary name for themselves. So by that you mean the College of Cardinals, the mark of Cain. Yeah, they stand by the Orthodox teaching that all of us were marked by Cain, by his murder of his brother Abel. You're born damned, in other words. That's the ideology they need to implant on you to keep you ashamed and frightened and dependent on priests and putting money in the plate on Sunday.
Is the Vatican now compromised by US influence in an attempt to prolong US hegemony?
No, it's more like the other way around. All financial roads lead to Rome. That's why all the presidents go over there and pay homage. But the impression they created about this guy, Robert Prevost, is that, oh, he's an American, so America now has more influence. No, he's in among the College of Cardinals. He was called the second Latin American Pope after Bergoglio, because he did all his work there. All of his nefarious activities really started in Peru, Argentina, a strong link with Bergoglio and stuff we've talked about that he did there. So yeah, I think it's more like, Vatican running things.
What is the CCP connection?
Well, we did talk about this. The only country in the world where the government gets to appoint Catholic bishops and cardinals is China. And they actually have a joint committee with the church where it's like a joint church-state operation with what's called the Chinese Communist Party. It's like the name of their government. So, I mean, we've talked about this, but that's kind of the general situation.
Lisa is curious whether the big name Catholic apologists are paid to push false Catholic doctrines.
Not just paid, but I mean, there's an arrangement now with, I know this, having been a Protestant minister, when I started criticizing the World Council of Churches, which is the Protestant, it's kind of like the International Federation of Protestant Churches in the world, a lot of them. And they were pro-Vatican, openly. They renounced the traditional policy of Protestant churches to call the